high quality decision there. What I have learned in my career, almost 40 years there, is that you see two kinds of people, two kinds of approaches there. Some people, some schools believe that you can build competitive advantage by doing a lot of studying, investigating the market, investigating all the scenarios, trying to quantify them and make the best decision there. And there's another school who says now, you can't do that there. You build competitive advantage by quickly learning, failing fast, and then changing your mind there. And I think that if you look now, Agile, and I especially come from Agile in product development, it works especially well in those circumstances where there's a lot of uncertainty, where you cannot exactly specify what you need to do, how you have to do that. And then the principle of don't decide what you don't have to decide yet, and try to get feedback as fast as possible on the facts that you have, the assumptions that you had in your decision calculation. That makes a lot of sense, and that makes that your decision process, although you're both interested in the best design quality, your decision process is much more focused on what decisions can I validate as fast as possible, rather than spending a lot of time in thinking through all the possible decisions there. So that would be my answer on that first question.
Okay, that's great. Carl, what's your perspective on this?
Well, my first reaction is we're comparing apples to oranges. Okay, so I think of Agile as a management approach with a lot of rapid learning, as was already pointed out, a lot of iteration, parallel paths, but you know where you're trying to go. Okay, and if you don't know where you're trying to go, Agile doesn't work. So you have to figure out where to go. Now, if you have to choose among very significantly different alternatives, then yeah, you might do Agile within each of all the alternatives as a management process and as a way of going it. It's not only a decision process, it's a way of working. It's a process for managing. And I think the constant in all of this is the definition of decision quality. Decision quality, there are 6 requirements. I think probably everybody here knows what they are. And you have to meet those requirements to have a quality decision, whether you're in the Agile mode or whether you're in a strategic decision mode. And then there's the second thing is there's a nature to the decision. If you can have a reversible, easy, low-cost decision so that you can reverse quickly and go back, what they call at Amazon, a 2-way door, as opposed to a 1-way door. If you have to choose among a series of 1-way doors, and you can't go back, like you do with $1 billion sanction of a big project, that's just not by itself. And Agile isn't the appropriate mindset. The mindset within the decision analysis could very well be Agile. Okay, so we do a lot of iteration and rapid learning and trying things and starting with a simple model and then cycling. So to me, when we compare these two frameworks, the framework that people think of because we are helpers to decision makers tends to be the whole dialogue process and all of that. I think that can be non-Agile the way it's being applied by some organizations. But the destination of having a quality decision that meets the 6 requirements is just as important when you make in an Agile frame as you are in a strategic choice among significantly different alternatives frame. Okay, so the question is, what's the nature of decision we're trying to make, and fit for purpose approaches? And I think decision quality has to be in the hands of the decision maker in the Agile process, as opposed to in a decision support organization or someone that's going to help them. In an agile mode, you're not going to call a decision consultant for the individual decisions because you're going to make them rapidly. You have to have it. So the nature of the problem and the need for a management process, if you can be agile, it's better, faster, because you can learn quickly, but it isn't always the approach that is appropriate for the decision you're facing.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. Let's hear it from Colin. Yeah, Colin, what's your view?
Thanks, Jean-Paul. So I'm not an agile professional, nor am I a DQ professional. So I'm a project manager, and one of the things that I view is they're both just tools, and you have to use the appropriate tool for the appropriate job that it's trying to do. There's a lot of overlap, sure, but there are distinct differences where you want to use them in one place rather than the other. So one of the big overlaps is being very clear on what decisions you're trying to make, and then when you look at that decision, trying to be really clear about what it is that drives that decision and trying to do the minimum work to actually make that decision. And Agile is really all about trying to do the minimum amount of work to get things done. So there's quite a lot of overlap from that perspective. So that's where the overlap really is. And can you run them both together? Absolutely. But you've got to be careful about going to the extreme and assuming that any particular thing, whether it's DQ or Agile or whatever else the thing, is going to solve all your problems, because it won't. It can help you, but it's not the ultimate answer. And you've just got to know what's the right balance and when to choose the right tool for the right job.
Okay. Thank you, Colin. Mike, what's your view on this?
Thanks, Jean-Paul, and welcome everyone. I like what I've heard from everybody thus far. I will say I don't see any reason to worry about a lack of overlap, because there are some things that work very well together when we're looking at decision quality in an agile framework, almost no matter what type of problem we're addressing. We're pretty early. I'm looking at this from a DADQ perspective, so my bias is from that perspective. But I'll say that when we are trying to use agile frameworks as a delivery mechanism for getting through to making high quality decisions, we're finding this can be very effective in different parts of our organization. And the key that we seem to be finding that adds the most value to that is clearly understanding what our objectives are up front, so that we really do define the problem well. And if we do that, then the agile delivery mechanism does a great job of helping empower teams, focus them on delivering high quality decisions throughout the process of getting to the end point of a decision. And almost whether it's a revocable decision or at least something that you can easily back out of, or if it is a large major capital project that we're looking for an FID on. So we are finding that as long as we are being agile, we're keeping that rapid cadence. If we're focused on the problem and sort of building from a bottom-up approach, that we can attain pretty high decision quality as long as we're regularly checking that decision quality and those 6 elements of DQ are being addressed and gaps assessed and identified as we go along. So I think we're still along the journey. We're not saying we're there, but throughout our organization, we have pockets of excellence that have done a pretty good job of integrating decision quality and decision analysis within an agile framework, and it's been pretty successful. So I think there's a very high degree of overlap and opportunity for advancement of decision quality within an agile framework.
That's fantastic. Yes, I can see some overlap in your answers as well. So that's a double whammy. Basil, can we have your views?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciated hearing everyone's views on this topic. It made me ponder myself. But You know, what I can say is when I read the question, it actually struck me as a bit unusual because all the questions seem to frame this as though you're choosing one or the other. I think I heard somebody mention apple or oranges earlier. We think of Agile, or in the broader context, business agility, as simply a way to get things done. And there's been a lot of focus on the process, but actually one of the big things that we try to promote here is autonomy. But before you grant autonomy to the organization, you have to get alignment. And that's one of the things that using Agile frameworks and promoting an Agile mindset really takes hold in your organization. And it's that alignment that creates the autonomy. And then it's the autonomy that creates a really fast and nimble culture. And that's what we're seeing within TCO, is that when you can get those things and when you can empower teams to work, you inherently get decision quality at scale, right? You remove the bottlenecks of leaders having to make decisions. And so in that sense, that's a really important aspect of what working in an Agile way means. If you zoom down to the individual opportunity or project or whatever you're trying to solve, we have always promoted high decision quality. Just because we're working in an Agile way, by no means we anticipate any less. And in most cases, we actually anticipate higher decision quality. And why is that? It's because we're engaging our teams, we're engaging our leaders in a different way. We're using short feedback loops to test what the team is thinking. Within Chevron, for those of you that in this industry, or even if you've worked at Chevron, the dreaded word recycle, right? When you get to a key decision point and it's not good enough, or the team didn't make enough assessments, they get recycled. We replace that with iteration. So it's a really safe space for teams to come with solutions, to test them. And I think as somebody said earlier, typically when they're irreversible, get feedback and then go back and work again. And the system in itself, it promotes feedback. It promotes leaders removing barriers instead of telling teams what to do. So when you combine all of that together, we're seeing much better decision quality at scale throughout the entire organization, not just in one place.
Some very compelling phrases that you've all used. Just reflecting on what Carl started off saying, it's Agile as a management process. I heard basically Mike say the same thing, calling it the delivery mechanism, which I really like the phrasing of that. And I think you know, Basil then mentioned it as a way of getting things done. I think all of these things are along one theme and perfectly compatible with I believe with Hans and Colin's comments as well. So so let's go to the next question, which is what conflict, if any, do you see between decision quality and Agile? And one of the things that I reflected on a little bit was that, you know, what the decision quality 101 or decision analysis 101 is you can't judge the quality of your decision by the outcome, whereas it seems to work the other way around with Agile. So it's kind of an interesting different way of thinking about it. So let me ask the question around conflict. Let me start with Carl first this time around.
So, Jan-Paul, repeat the specific question one more time, because I want to make sure that I'm really addressing that, because a lot of thoughts came to mind as you introduced this.
Sorry. What conflict, if any, do you see between decision quality and Agile?
So this decision outcome point that you made, you can't judge the decision by its outcome, works just as much in Agile as in big strategic choices, okay? But the point that was made, I think, by every one of the panelists, what we're trying with Agile is to get short feedback loops and learn quickly and do a lot of things in parallel, stop the things that don't work, accelerate on the ones that really make a difference. All of that works very well. And I think the point was made, when we're aligned, that means we can see where we're trying to go. So if, for example, on a big strategic decision, we have to investigate 4 different alternatives, okay, and we really have significant choices among them, we can use Agile within each of those, and that's probably the best way to really make those alternatives be the best they can be. But the choice among those alternatives itself doesn't fit the Agile model, okay? So I think that it's the blending of these two as to saying, what are we trying to do? And the measurements of a quality decision should be the same, except in Agile, they have to be embedded in the person that's the project leader. They're not just, it's not, you can't do it in the decision support person, because it has to be done rapidly around the table with this empowered approach that people have said, which requires alignment and understanding. So you want everybody to be able to do this. That is the mainstream frontline leadership and management, to know the 6 elements of decision quality, to be able to quickly judge what the gaps are we there yet on the frame, on the alternatives, and then fill the gaps with rapid iteration, which is an Agile approach, okay? So that's, to me, how those two connect completely. And it's not one framework versus the other. It's what are we trying to accomplish? And if we're trying to accomplish it, then Agile, I try to have Agile on everything that I can, and trying to be Agile on something where it's the wrong way and I bent the problem into it, then it's the wrong approach, okay?
Okay, all right. Same question to you.
Yeah, and thank you, because I was the first one there, and I heard the other people speaking up, and I tend to disagree a bit that we all said the same, because I think I said something differently there. For me, Agile is not a tool, and I agree with empowered people and having a faster decision processes because of that. But for me, Agile is about accepting uncertainty. And we don't know, we even cannot specify the alternatives there. If you have COVID-19, we have no clue. We have to take decisions, but we have no clue. We don't know the alternatives. We cannot assign probabilities to it. We have no clue what we are talking about. There are no cause-effect relations you can specify. You are totally in the dark there. And I think all that, the Monte Carlo methods and all these kind of nice things on decision quality, that's nice from an academic point of view, but in my 40 years in experience, most of the decisions I had to take, I was in the fully dark there. And that is where the Agile mindset helps, that you accept there's uncertainty, that you have to take decisions without knowing everything there. And so it doesn't help to say you cannot specify the ultimate goal. You cannot specify the alternatives there. The only thing you can do is start something and learn as fast as possible. Postpone all the decisions you don't have to take yet, and try to validate the assumptions as fast as possible, which is radically different than a lot of things that we do in a more traditional way of decision making there. So that is for me the essence there. And so I think that if you talk about any conflict, and there's not a fundamental conflict, you would still like to make the best decision. It is that a lot of the tools that we used to have and pretending the kind of illusion that there is no uncertainty there, that we pretending that we could do it, they are not so useful anymore. We need different ways to work together to deal with that uncertainty. And for me, that is the essence of Agile.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Let's go to Basil.
Yeah, I mean, my comments are consistent with the last. When we talk about this, when we use this word conflict, it's as though they're two separate things, and they're not compatible. And again, that is not how we view business agility. That's not how we view some of the different Agile frameworks that we use to achieve business agility. So I said decision quality is always important, right? Rarely do we make a decision where we say, let's just put decision quality aside. Now, different decisions have a different sort of solution space and a different risk envelope. So we may be able to live with less decision quality for the sake of speed or for the sake of delivering something, certainly, but we are simply using Agile to organize our teams. And there's an old adage that that really explains how this works for us is, I'll know what I want when I see it. And we tended to build a culture where deliver a perfect solution to a decision review board or a leader or whomever is making the decision. And that often brought anxiety. It brought lethargic ways of working because people were really trying to aim for this perfect solution. You know, now when we think about decision quality, we think about take an iteration, take a first pass, show the contours of what it looks like, show that to the leaders, and we see this every time. Once they see a potential solution, or at least a frame of a potential solution, that's when the rich feedback starts. And that's when teams can prioritize and align on delivering something that achieves what the leaders believe brings value to the company. So no, I don't see any conflict. I mean, these things, it's like asking, is the airplane's engine in conflict with the wing? No, they both support each other. You need both of them.
Okay, thank you. Mike, and maybe you can also pick up a little bit the point that Han made about just thinking about uncertainty as something that is intrinsically unsolvable. You don't have any control over that. Maybe you can give some. Maybe you can kind of respond to that view.
Well, I'll jump in on that because I do think that's actually one of the key benefits of having utilizing an Agile framework, because you do have the opportunity to learn something quickly and then pivot based upon what you've learned. And if you have those rapid feedback loops where you're getting to talk to people as you learn, you may end up framing things a little bit differently. And I think that's one of the things we're finding. We're spending a lot of time up front. Well, we're spending time up front to make sure that we clearly understand what our essential objectives are for a project or opportunity. That way, we get a good start on what needs to be done first to learn the most that's going to add the most value to us. So we're trying to be value focused and objectives focused up front. And then when the team gets working in an Agile way, then they are quickly trying to learn something. And then once they've learned something, aim in the direction of understanding what the next step might be. So one of the framing differences that we're seeing is that rather than trying to elicit a wide range of creative, doable alternatives, we're ending up starting with something small and building from a bottom-up type approach. What is maybe a low-cost, low-effort solution to our problem? And we'll learn something from understanding what that might be, and then build upon that. Say, what doesn't get solved by this? What uncertainties aren't being addressed? What opportunities do we have? So we learn something, and then we can adjust and give our decision makers and the team themselves some opportunities to say, where might we capture more value? And where might things be able to be more amenable to learning and to changing what it is we're doing to try to solve what problem it is that we have at this point in time. So again, I don't see any conflicts between decision quality and the decision analysis processes. It just may be that we will frame things a little bit more agile as well. We may be starting from a smaller subset of alternatives and building up only when we see something that's been prioritized in our backlog as having some next opportunity to gain value. So it's spreading out some parts of our framing as we're learning, so that we're adapting and building on the knowledge that we gain as we go through the process, and giving the team that power to learn as they go, and inform decision makers so they can pivot in the right directions.
Thanks. So Colin, maybe your perspective is one from managing major projects. So maybe you're more vexed with all of this uncertainty ahead of you and working with that. What's your experience with that?
I think it just comes down to being sensible about when you apply the different approaches, because Agile by itself isn't just one thing. It's actually, okay, it's a mindset, but it's also a series of different tools inside that Agile which allow you to do different things. And so, you know, the only conflict really, I think, is just going overboard. So if you believe that Agile is the only way to solve every problem, you'll probably get unstuck. So I don't know, supposing you're trying to calculate, say, the U value, the amount of insulation required on a flow line. No amount of agility is going to help you with it. You've actually got to do the engineering calculations to work that out. And when you work that out, then you can work out the thickness of the pipeline, the thickness of the of what's available, and you can decide if you can install it. You've just got to do the engineering. So I think the only real conflict about any of these is going overboard and believing that a particular thing is the answer to every problem. It may be an answer to several of your problems, but it's not going to answer all of them.
Excellent. All right. So let's move to the third question that we posed to all of you. So this is when you've got an organization that's particularly oriented to one of the two ways of thinking, whether DQ is completely embedded or whether Agile is completely embedded. Are there specific challenges that you can recognize in introducing the other framework? So that's the question. I'm going to start again with our thought leaders. So Han, maybe you can take this one first.
Yes, sir. Yeah, thank you for that. And let me first say that I agreed with, I think what Colin has said is, of course, there are situations where you can have a non-agile way of working, and sometimes an agile way of working is working quite well. And you should always try to find the best approach there. What I have seen, and I really position Agile as a way to deal with that uncertainty. I've seen a lot of innovation projects. I recently did do a lot of machine building. We wanted to demonstrate something, but nobody had, even the customer had no clue what exactly was required in 1 year time to demonstrate at the next exhibition there. So together we were trying to find the right way. So what I've seen is one of the problems, one of the pitfalls I've seen, and especially in those situations where there is a lot of uncertainty, is that managers can't deal with that. So in my view, in that uncertainty, then you don't have a model. You cannot have predefine your cause-effect relations, and managers hate that. Managers cannot deal with the situation that you don't know which knot to turn to make sure that a certain effect will come there. They want predictability, and they go to the software engineer and say, hey, you are the professional, you should know what to do, and he also doesn't know there. So the only thing he can do is you build huge buffers, either in being on the safe side on what we will deliver, or be on the safe side in your estimations there, and buffers always fill, and then your productivity is going down, but it doesn't help in predictability there. And so the leadership is one of the biggest problems in areas where there's a lot of uncertainty, and they can't deal with that uncertainty there, and they are totally paralyzing the entire organization. On the other side, if you could still have a bit of that common sense, think first there, because it's not as uncertain as you want, and then you see in Agile, some Agile organizations, I have seen that people say now, let's just start. We don't have to think in advance there. No, whatever you can think in advance, it's worthwhile to do that there. It's too easy to just start there. And so finding that right balance, and an Agile operation, sometimes you can do a little bit more thinking in advance. And if there's a lot of uncertainty, leadership can accept a little bit more than that there's uncertainty. This is typically pitfalls I see in many of these organizations.
Thank you. Carl, what's your view?
I think of two kinds of organizations. One, let's say, one of these major oil companies that had adopted DQ first and had gotten right kind of process intensive and with a dialogue process, and it got kind of process heavy. Okay, that's the starting point. Or you take a software company which is deeply agile and has a real difficulty looking at big strategic decisions because everything is agile, okay? And there's a lot of redo and recycle and so on when they go down the wrong road. I think that they're very different challenges to bring the other in. I do think that the companies that have adopted DQ and adopted it with this mindset that DQ is a process that requires doing things in a stepwise fashion and getting perfection on the frame and then this, I think Agile is a very powerful way to accelerate the way of getting to decision. But the key distinction that people have to make is whether we need to have a careful examination of significantly different roads or paths or strategies, whatever you want to call them, or whether we can attach to one and run different trials and learn as rapidly down that one road, okay? That difference is so fundamental that you have to judge which mode you're in. Once you go, and human attachment is probably our biggest bias that we have. We start believing in something, we start bolstering information, having selective evidence bias, confirming evidence bias, everything works towards us thinking narrowly and getting attached. That's okay if you can learn rapidly and have lots of iterations and you're on the right general direction. It's deadly if you want to look at truly different alternatives. So the question is, what's needed here? And it's not a choice so much. So that differentiation is more of a diagnosis of the decision situations of what are we in. If we are running down, defining one alternative very well, doing that in an agile manner, I think is a terrific advantage over the process intensive people getting stuck and wanting to do things in a linear, stepwise waterfall approach, as they talk about in the agile world, okay? So it's, are you within a path that you want to improve? Or are you trying to figure out among alternatives? People even generate multiple agile teams to go down different paths to be able to really make it a choice among significantly different alternatives. In these oil company presence, when you're at concept select, I think you can use Agile within each concept to get the concepts crystallized to the point when you can make a significant decision and compare the alternatives. That itself is not an agile act, okay?
Okay, thank you. Colin, I don't know whether I can characterize BP as an agile version of the oil and gas industry, but it seems to me that you really chose to go that way. So if you characterize BP as an agile organization, does that give challenges to embed decision quality wider than where it already is?
Well, let me give you an example where it didn't work, and that maybe answers it. This is a project in Trinidad, looking at how to develop a small gas field, and the fundamental choice was: do you put a conventional NUI on there, normally unmanned installation on there, or do you? And we say that's normally unmanned, but we still go and see it once every 3 or 4 days. Or do you actually try and do something like they've done in the North Sea with subsea on the stick, where you actually take off the accommodation, you take off the heli deck, and you actually go and visit it once a year, and you bring a walk-to-work vessel with you? It's a great project, but the guy who ran it sort of said, like, I'm going to experiment. I'm going to try just purely agile process. So he ran it like a scrum. He had a product backlog. He used that to drive deliverables. He didn't have a sort of conventional Gantt chart and a project schedule. I visited, and when I visited, I asked if I could sit in on his project meeting, and it was really interesting to sort of sit through and listen to it. And there's lots of very interesting sort of engineering discussed. You know, talked about how corrosive the fluids were, and could we get by with normal steel, carbon steel, or we have to have sort of stainless steel? Lots of other interesting things about valve choices that were there. But afterwards, I sat down with him and said, "Look, your fundamental choice, surely doesn't it depend on actually how reliable are the systems, and can you instrument them well enough so that you know 6 months in advance where something's going to fail?" And when we discussed it, he said, "Yeah, you're right. We've got lost in the weeds here about what's really we're trying to do." And as a result of that, he modified the process, and the project it wasn't just my input, I used to say, that made him change. He'd have got there by himself, I'm absolutely certain. But that was an example where following one process, actually, you kind of lost track of what you were really trying to do. So I think and that's why I would say, if you are, you know, either one way or the other, just beware of going too far the other way, and keep the balance there between, you know, focusing on the big picture and then using that where it actually makes sense to do so.
Thanks, Colin. Interesting example. Mike?
Well, you asked what some of the challenges are, and I think they have been discussed a bit. And I will say, as a company that had a lot of history with decision analysis and decision quality embedded in the organization, one of our challenges when looking at agile frameworks is, where do we start and how robust does the frame have to be? And so if there is a propensity to getting a lot of agreement on what the frame is and a very complete frame, that was very challenging for starting an agile project. And the flip side was people that were starting agile projects trying to exclude DADQ up front were finding that they were not using almost any frame. They had a very light touch on what the opportunity was about. And then they felt they would learn and reframe as they went. So that dichotomy was a challenge for everyone involved. And I think where we're seeing, in our perspective, some areas for benefit is where we're at least agreeing on what's essential up front. And what are we really trying to strive for, whether we know a lot about the uncertainties or where we're going to be headed. And we're finding we don't need to have multiple paths where multiple agile teams are working on a particular problem. What they can do is say, okay, let's start maybe with the small one or something that we think is small, work on that for a while, and then say, where are problems or where are opportunities for something else? Keeping in mind where value can be generated and where it can be built. So we can look at a particular alternative, build it up to a point and say, okay, what's this not solving, or what is it solving, and what are the opportunities that are laying, that we've identified, haven't evaluated closely? What might be the next one that we're going to look at? And so that, again, it's sort of stretching out the framing so that we're learning something along the way as we're developing alternatives to assess them to a point that we can say, this is good, is there something better? And when we try something else, is it worse or better? So we can look at an irrevocable decision, a big FID on a major capital project, and just build up multiple alternatives as we get further along the process, but making sure that we're going to add incremental value for something that we're going to spend more on that for. So we're assessing the DQ elements on each of those individual steps along the way. So again, it's that we're starting out a little bit differently, and so we have to be willing to be able to go back and revisit something if we've gone down a path that doesn't look appropriate. Basil mentioned earlier that recycle issue shouldn't have a bunch of negatives associated with it if we've learned something and have been able to go down a better path.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm too tempted to ask you a follow-up question on that, so I will do that. It's fascinating that you start with a narrow frame and then learn essentially what the right questions are to ask. Do you think there is a risk associated with with doing it that way, that you're basically, it's too challenging to step out of that and to look at something that is much broader than what you started off with?
Well, I think that's a great follow-up question there, because if you understand what you think are the essential objectives of the project, but you've also captured some, I'll say, non-essential or not as important objectives right up front, and you sort of prioritize those, then when you get to a point of evaluating something, you can say, well, we've left this reservoir untested. How can we capture the value from that in an oil industry perspective? What would it take? How much additional investment? Is that good for us to go down that path as well? So we're not precluding things as we move forward. We're just making sure that we prioritize things up front so that we have good, and then we can build upon that or find out if that doesn't work, can we go down one of the other alternative paths? But thinking about where value can be generated.
Yeah, so you need to be clear that incrementally you're not going to end up in a space that you don't want to get
Correct.
to. Yeah. Okay. Good. Basil, let's hear your views.
Yeah, I think you know, a lot of you have talked about how some of these the pitfalls in the process. One thing I think that we learned that was really important is when we started to pilot and test and experiment with Agile, we found pockets of excellence. And I think those pockets of excellence existed where we engaged with our DA and DQ community and used them as the thought partners in how we use Agile to make different decisions. I think in some other areas, it was positioned as two separate things. And so certainly when you really want to bring this into the fold and you want to make them work together, think about how you engage that existing community that you have within your organization. And if you engage them the right way at the beginning, what you'll find is they'll be really innovative. You'll have decision analysts or DQ analysts or advisors that will actually take Agile ways of working, which are pretty natural if you look at the basic principles. And they'll find really creative ways to apply high DQ within these Agile frameworks. If, you know, like any organism, when they see something that threatens their being within the organization, I think it's easy for them to look at it and say that doesn't work, or there's only certain situations it works in. And just I did want to respond to a few things Carl said. We found something really interesting. So Carl, you were talking about big strategic decisions, right? Irreversible decisions. And I completely agree with you. We've been using agility and iterations to build up to those decisions, to hopefully make the right decisions. But something really interesting happened is that when teams get iteration or Agile built into their DNA a bit, they find ways to take what we thought was an irreversible decision and make it reversible. They find ways to stage things. They find ways to do things smaller. And for us, that's a more nimble company, right? We don't need to always be making huge decisions. A lot of examples of where we approached things and we thought this is a $500 million decision or bigger, and the team came back with a way to resolve it, to start small and to build up while still retaining the value. So, you know, I think when you build an organization with that culture, you may find that you have fewer big decisions and that you're still getting the value you need through smaller increments.
I think that's great. Great story, Basil. Great that works, and it kind of leads into the last question. I think I'd like to open it up. So any one of the panel members wanting to respond to that, we started to talk about this, but when does this integration really work, and when doesn't it work? Carl already mentioned very different decision context, those sort of things. Is it a function of the business environment? Is it the type of decision problem? Is it a leadership problem? You know, where does it come from? So when does integration work particularly well, and when doesn't it work?
Jan Paul, this is Carl, and let me just ask the rest of the panel if they have the same sense as I do from listening to this. when we can, we would prefer to be agile rather than commit something where in the face of uncertainty we can't turn around. Okay, is everybody in agreement that when you have the ability, and as Basil just said, it makes us think of situations and be creative of how to make things more flexible and nimble. But when we can be turn something that would be hugely irreversible into something reversible and apply Agile as a methodology, we all would agree that's a better way to go. If you can learn rapidly and do it, that's cheaper and better than doing something irreversible. Is that correct?
Karel, I would turn it around. If you would be able to identify all the options before, and you know exactly where to go for, then the traditional way of decision analysis, decision equality is very appropriate. In all the other cases, you better do Agile.
I'm, I guess, slightly different again. Maybe I'll give an example of my last project, the Net Zero Teesside project. We started off with a classical business framing, which was fantastic, gave us about 10 key decisions about, and what's unusual about the Net Zero Teesside project is that most of the decisions in typical projects are all technical. These, a lot of them were actually really fundamental business problems, like how are you actually going to get paid for decarbonising industry in Teesside? How's that going to work? So it was a little bit different from that. So nevertheless, we had a series of very clear decisions. We had about 5 technical decisions and 5 commercial decisions to make. That was very helpful. But then as we started to consider some of those questions, we then asked ourselves which ones of those are most appropriate to be tackled in an agile manner. So for example, one of the things we wanted to decide on, one of the things in the project was one of the questions was, should we build a power station? And we realized very quickly that we did need to build a power station. So the next question is, okay, if you build a power station and you need to decarbonize that power station, what should it do? And if you look at the electricity supply situation in the UK, it's very clear that gas-fired power, decarbonized gas-fired power, is going to be more expensive than offshore wind. So you then realize that what you need to do is to build a gas-fired power station that can ramp up only when it's not windy and shuts down when it's windy. And that's fine for a power station. We know how to do that, but we don't know how to do that for a carbon capture plant. That's never been done before. And so what we did, one of the things we realized is actually that topic, can you actually ramp up a CCUS plant, an integrated CCUS plant with power, and ramp it up and down? That's really appropriate for an integrated Scrum approach, where you know what you answer you want to do, but you don't know if it can be done, and you don't know what steps you've got to do, and you don't know what things you can maybe there are sort of options for investing which actually make it easier to ramp up and down as well. All those sorts of questions, and that process worked really well. Within about 4 weeks, we got a really clear answer that yes, we can do it. And yes, there are 3 or 4 things we can look at to make it better. And it's just, and that was then a question to the government, we can do this, is it worth that trade-off to you? Ultimately, is the proxy for the customer for us to do that. So that was really helpful. The other area where we used it for was stakeholder management. This project was the most complicated from stakeholders I ever worked in. So we had a project meeting every Monday. And we had 13 areas we discussed, of which 10 of them were stakeholder management. And it was very hard to keep all that stakeholder stuff in your head in any particular way. And we were really struggling with the process. And we were lucky we had an agile coach who came with us and structured it. She said, okay, think about each of those. What do you want to do for each of those stakeholders? Where do you want to get to by the end of the year? What do you want to do in the next 3 months? What do you want to do in the next month? And then every month say, which of those 10 stakeholders, which are your top 3 priorities? And by doing that, it put a much richer structure around that. I mean, you can't have it like a Gantt chart because you've got no idea how long it's going to take for the government to react. But it's wonderful to be able to have a very flexible approach like that allows you to respond, but nevertheless keep the priority on the key stakeholders. So, we used the business framing process at the beginning to work out the decisions, and then we decided we were very sort of deliberate about where we decided to throw Agile at it and the areas where we thought it was going to be most useful. And they were typically pretty well-defined find problems with lots of integration, but also we didn't know how we were going to solve it. That was what we typically found the most use for it.
Colin, can I ask a question there? All these stakeholders, did you find that some of them have difficulty to accept that it was not so predictable and that they, how to deal with that? And that maybe one of the essential problems in dealing with that problem?
So one of the stakeholders themselves were the unpredictable thing. So we didn't tell them that they were very unpredictable. So they didn't really know that we were doing all this stuff. We were, as far as they were concerned, we were just talking to them. But it was actually how long they would take to respond, which was the unpredictability, and how they would respond, which is the unpredictability.
Okay. Fascinating. Can I suggest that we open up the floor to some other questions that have been raised in the chat box? Maybe Warwick and Marielle, maybe there's, can you highlight a couple of questions that have come up?
Surely, we have quite a few coming in, and I'm really surprised and also really grateful to you panelists, because you kept answering the questions in the chat, which I wasn't expecting to see. That's pretty efficient because you have answered quite a few along the way, so that's really good, and thank you for that. There are a couple of them that were no answered, and I will leave Warwick to lead those. But I wanted to point some comments that were coming when we were discussing about question number 2 about the conflict between Agile and DQ. And there were comments from people in the meeting more than questions about how they see it. So we have some views from Becky Watson talking about how she thinks that Agile is an approach that you would like to take to deliver something. But she says also, she makes a point about how DQ should be seen, or decision quality should be, we should see it the same as we see quality of a product or quality control. And why is it not that we see that way? So she sort of make her statement and then sort of put that into the room about decision quality and just quality or product quality control itself, why we're not thinking about them the same. It's a point she's making. We got something from Robert Ward saying that, that DQ could create alignment between groups, and I think between teams. Perhaps it's sort of what Colin was addressing as well with the example he just gave us. So earlier, Robert was making that point as well about, working effectively when you have 2 teams doing different things. He quoted an example about a platform and a new development project working with a platform. So he said that DQ could resolve issues like that. That's an interesting point as well. We got something more here from Gustav Erling talking about an agile mindset and agile processes, and try to make the difference between what the mindset should be and how heavy the process might be, and probably that's something that we don't want to get into. So I'm sort of paraphrasing the ideas coming in the chat, but really good chat. I will save this because there are many more discussions going on. And I will pass it to Warwick for the key questions that perhaps we would like to address that were not already answered by you guys in the meantime.
Thanks, Marielle. And I mean, I'll just add my voice that it's worth having a look in the chat if you're not already looking in the chat. There's a fair bit of back and forth going on, so it's not just questions. I've picked a few out that are specific questions, and I think it might make life a bit easier for all of us if I just share. Oh, Jan-Paul, can you stop sharing so I can share this, because I'll just put the questions
I'm not sharing.
Who's sharing the slides at the moment? Is that you, Marielle?
It's me. You want me to stop?
Can you? Yeah, apparently I can't share until you.
Okay, stop now. You should be able to.
Okay, good. Let me just share. So I've put some of these questions on the screen just so that it makes it easier. So there were, maybe first set of questions, there were 3 questions that probably, Basil, if you could have a crack at. One was really, the first one was around how do your partners that you're working in the JV with, how do they view the Agile approach? Maybe the second one then is, when you think about short feedback loops, we've talked about Agile as these short feedback loops and learning that way. What does that really look like in a major capital project? And we've maybe had a little bit of insight on that already. And then you've also mentioned this need for alignment and to allow the autonomy to get a nimble organization, but where's that alignment coming from? And maybe just some quick thoughts on that.
The first one on partners is pretty straightforward. I mean, we share with our partners here amongst Chevron, Exxon, KMG, and Lukoil what we're doing with agility. And we also share with them the value that we're deriving from it. So from that perspective, I don't think we've had any pushback. They want to learn more. And we're also thinking about when we haven't done this yet, but we're experimenting with how do we build some of the decisions that require partners to approve or to provide feedback? How do we build them into these iterations, right? Because it's one thing for us to arrive at an answer within TCO or Tengiz Chevron. It's another to then have to go to the partners and get approval, and then they give us feedback that would have been useful, right? So how do we engage our partners, or all key decision makers, I should say? That's a bit trickier, but that's something we're exploring. And as we've kind of socialized this concept with our partners, I think they're coming up to be more amenable to working in such a way. The second question is a good one. So what do short feedback loops look like in the front end of a major capital project? So what we would typically call the front end is typically anything before your final investment decision. I know that varies company to company, but what we found is that the early part of a project is where you can create the most value or potentially destroy. And this is where teams would often be working in silos to come up with the perfect solution. And there would be big formal decision review boards, and you would take your solution there. And in some instances, there might be some inertia with that solution, and everybody moves forward because so much work has been done. You don't want to recycle the team. I talked about that earlier. So using short feedback loops, as I said, is really positioning teams and leaders differently. And we haven't talked a lot about that, but there's a bit of social technology going on here and how we put people together, how they interact with each other, the project team, and how they interact with decision makers in a much different way than they were used to. And what that means is that there isn't a big decision review board anymore. We know when we've done enough work that the decision has been made and we move on. So that means technical teams bringing their various technical solutions or different alternatives forward. That means commercial teams working through different terms and conditions or different conditions precedent that they want to set to move forward. Again, in short iterations, not perfect solutions at the beginning, but building towards that, engaging leaders a different way. And, again, this last one on alignment and autonomy, I mean, this is critical because I think there's been a lot of emphasis in this discussion about big major capital projects, but actually a lot of the value that we derive within, our existing operation, which is pushing almost 700,000 barrels a day, is running the business efficiently. And that means hundreds, even thousands of small decisions that are made every day. And so this is where we want to build strategic context within the organization so that leaders know what our priorities are and that leaders can cascade those in such a way that you can have autonomous teams make those decisions without all decisions floating to the top, because that's not efficient. That's a bottleneck. When a small group of leaders have to make every important decision, you by definition will not be nimble as a company. So by cascading that alignment, we're able to provide these small autonomous project teams or teams working on different strategies. They're able to understand their solution space and deliver against that. And again, that makes them fast, and it creates really happy employees, which is the best part about all of this, because happy employees tend to do really good work.
So I just want to come back, actually, probably in light of what you've just answered on 3 and talking about autonomy, but when you get back to 2, you talked about, we know when the decision's made, but so who's actually making the decisions? Are the decisions being pushed down the organization inherently in this approach, or is it still being made by a senior executive somewhere?
I would say it's lower than it used to be. So it depends on the decision size. We very much promote a product owner role for every project. That is not the project manager. That's a different role. That's an individual who's closer to the work, who's closer to the people, who understands the dynamics. But that individual also has a relationship with what we call the sponsor. The sponsor typically understands the strategic context of a given project or a given opportunity. And it's the responsibility of that sponsor to ensure the product owner gets the strategic context and that they maintain a relationship where they test the boundaries or guardrails of a project. And then you can enable this small autonomous team or teams of teams sometimes to execute against that strategic objective within the guardrails. I know there's a lot of buzzwords there, but it works, and we're seeing it work at scale right now.
We always say as low as possible, but not lower.
Yeah, but I think that you're raising
Precisely.
a potentially interesting distinction in the way things typically work here. This dimension of pushing the decision making down the hierarchy. And has anyone else got a comment on that on the panel?
Yeah, maybe one more remark. You do that because you want to shorten the decision cycle. You see in a central decision-making process that there are very long cycle times very often for decision-making. By pushing it down, you can have a much more rapid decision process.
So I'll quote one of my leaders here that after seeing Agile work said, oftentimes some of our key leaders are the worst people to make tactical decisions. And so we're really trying to ensure that we get the strategic context from leaders and we let people closer to the work make those decisions. Because oftentimes if decisions float up too high, what we've seen is oftentimes you don't get an optimal decision, right? You get a lot of accountability for the decision because a senior leader is making it, but it's oftentimes not the decision that the team recommended, or it's not something connected with the work going on. So empowering teams makes them fast, but it also improves decision quality because we firmly believe those closest to the work know the best thing to do.
Thanks, Basil. Carl, I'd be interested to get your perspective on what's just been said, because I have a perception that sometimes the DQ approach or the dialogue process and so on sometimes does tend to elevate the decision making in practice. Whether that's the intention or not is a different question.
Yes. I think we need to separate here the principles and concepts from people's habitual practices that they have built up. Okay, and I do agree that the dialogue process as a way of getting to a decision has been overused because it has shown so much value on the strategic decisions that people apply it in all kinds of places, where an agile approach would be much better. And agile within the dialogue process is also a key idea. I've always been by nature much more of an agile person in wanting to try and experiment and learn quickly and reverse if you can, as opposed to wanting to make commitments unnecessarily. So now I think the key point here is to separate the requirements of decision quality, which I haven't found a situation where you won't knowingly want to violate those 6, okay? And if now separately from that is what's needed here, and having decision empowerment in the right place. Who should be responsible for decision quality? As Basil turns out has stated, it should be at the place where it is most likely that people can make a good decision, as opposed to some kind of a hierarchical structure of passing it up the buck higher and higher so you can have cover. Whatever it is, decision quality should be applied at the lowest level in the most agile way you can, but don't be agile in terms of having big choices. If I had to have surgery, and I know there are 4 different kinds of surgery, I don't want the surgeon to go in, try each one a little and to see what it would work before he goes choosing, okay? There's some places where you need to choose. The alternatives should compete with each other, and you better have alternatives. In many others, you can just try your way forward and find that you get to the solution much better, faster, okay? And I think these are not in conflict. These are more in our mindsets of what's appropriate in the situation that I'm facing.
Yeah, but Carl, can you maybe react to the recent COVID-19 crisis? Should we do a lockdown there? What do? We have the economic there. People have to take decisions and they have no clue what the consequences of the decisions will be.
Well, this is probably a long discussion, Han, because I think I've spent quite a bit of time with some kind of a panel of decision professionals, including Keeney and Howard and so on exactly that question. and let me tell you, the violation of decision quality principles, this is probably one of the best cases where politicizing and putting political games in front of the that decision was so fundamental that you couldn't get any logic in it.
No, but on the other side, you see that they try to learn from it and change again. And
so we do have in that some states in the U.S. that followed more, let me say, the Agile model and others followed big lockdown models and did so on. So we have a lot of examples of where people try different approaches that we can study with hindsight. The actual decision processes were not very based on what we as decision professionals would like to see done. Okay.
Can I suggest we maybe move on a little bit? See if there's some more questions here. So, Carl, I think you made a statement as you can't use Agile to choose between different alternatives. And is that true? And Han actually said something that in some situations, and I think we're right at this exact question we were just asking, some situations are just too unstructured to even list alternatives. So I think this gets right to the heart of maybe Agile is more appropriate in some more unstructured environments than DQ, than the traditional decision analysis approach. And I'd be interested to get perspectives from everybody on this.
Yeah.
So
sorry to interrupt, we only have 5 minutes, so you might want to choose 2 people to answer this one.
All right.
Yeah, we don't have everyone, and the problem is we will be cut out from the call. That's how it's going to work. So it would be really sad to just stop in the middle. So pick 2 and give.
Well, Han, I would like to get your view on this, and I'd like to understand whether your view is that Agile is appropriate in all situations, and it's a superior approach in all situations, or is it just in some situations where it's too unstructured to list out the alternatives ahead of time?
No, so it's, of course, it's not a silver bullet there. So whatever you can, if you can have these the 6 requirements and mention the alternatives in advance, that is always worthwhile to do. What I see happening in a lot of situations, and that especially leaders, they would like to pretend that everything is clear and you can just make that. You have a business plan. I have seen predictions of sales in 3 digits after the comma there, etc. And that was justifying the business case there. And for me, it is much more the mindset that we have to deal with the fact that sometimes you can't do it, and then maybe you don't have to take a decision, or let's take a decision now that's maybe not a perfect one, but at least I can very rapidly see if I'm on a totally wrong way there. So that's a bit a different mindset there. But when there is no uncertainty at all, and we know what to do, and then it's just a number of engineering calculations there. I think I think Mike mentioned that. Then we better do that, of course. I'm a mathematician from heart, so I've been taught to calculate everything there, but I've also learned that mathematics is the most unrealistic science that we have.
Carl, I think I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this question too. What's happened?
Who did you ask?
Sorry, Carl, I was asking what your response to that is.
Well, let me just say, I think that the question of can you use Agile to choose between different alternatives, I get back to a point I think that Mike made, or Colin made, where at some point you're going to have to do the calculations, and are you going to call the so understanding the consequence of each alternative, you're going to call that an Agile process? Well, yeah, modeling is done in an Agile way. You start with something as simple and you only model as far as you have to be able to understand the differences. So in many ways, this question of Agile is really a fit for purpose approach and an opening of our mindset that we have been ignoring some of the flexible, agile alternatives and creative solutions. And I think that's right on. That's a big, good shift in mindset. And wherever we can be agile, let's do it. But when we have to make a choice among significantly different options, or we have to even crystallize the options so we can make that choice be a clear one, then let's recognize that and do that. It's a matter of leadership and judgment to understand the situations. That's where I think the big opening has been, and empowerment and parallel efforts and rapid iteration. All of that stuff is very powerful, good stuff.
Thank you. Marielle, I take it that you've taken back control because our time is up.
Okay. Warwick, I wanted to pile on just a second, if possible.
Thank you.
Hey, Mike, we'll give you 1 minute.
Okay. Andrea brought up a question about local maxima. And I think that's actually what happens generally, that we get onto an alternative that looks great. Then we have to do just what Carl said. By challenging and having that open dialogue, we can see and think about what might we do that would address other things that aren't covered. So we can use an agile process to reinforce that questioning and challenging so that we preserve optionality as long as possible and stage as much as possible. So we can look at ways to add value by being agile and being fit for purpose. So I think that even if you look at getting in a local maxima, you still can say, okay, what would I do differently if I wanted to capture something else? So it's really all about how can we benefit from the combination of DQ and Agile.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think we're getting to the point in the afternoon where it's time to sort of close up and make some end remarks. And I wanted to say two things really. I think one is maybe just to say, for me, this has been a really, really rich conversation. There's been a lot of different threads in here, and I think I'm going to have to spend some time thinking about what I've heard today to pull it all together. There may be two ideas that just struck me, and I guess everyone's got their own thoughts about this, but I think one is this idea of Agile and DQ being approaches that you have to use in the right context and in the right place. And I think we've heard that from most people today, and that you've got these toolboxes and you've got these mindsets and these approaches to tackling the problems that we face, whether they're decision problems or they're problems of getting our decisions executed. Choosing the right things for the right context is really important. So I've heard that. And then the other idea that sort of jumped out at me as I was listening was this whole idea of, as we're making decisions, we're fundamentally learning. And it's something I think when I started to learn DQ and I thought about this idea of putting alternatives on the table, we're not necessarily putting alternatives on the table with a view to understand or to try to say, right, we've got 5 and what I've got to try and figure out which one is the best one. That actually behind it, what we're doing is we're putting 5 on the table to explore the space and understand more about the space. And ultimately what we do will be some hybrid or some result of the learning that comes from that. And I think what I heard coming out of the conversation this afternoon is that Agile actually achieves a similar thing, but maybe in a different way. That instead of trying to find 5 points in the space to begin with, you start burrowing into the space, and then you start looking around and seeing what you learn. And then you start to generate new alternatives for yourself that way. So I don't know if that's helpful, but those are two things I took away. I'm sure there'll be more as I think about it. And I think from my side, I just want to say really thank you very much to all 5 of our panelists for taking the time to come this afternoon and share generously your knowledge and your insights. So thank you very much. And I'm hand back to Jan-Paul for a few extra words here, closing words.
I think that I'm not quite sure that I can add anything to what you just said, Warwick. Really interesting debate, and thanks for sharing all your experience and examples and thoughts. It's clear that we had a very thoughtful and experienced panel. So very grateful, and thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Yeah.
Jan-Paul, is there any other business that we need to sort out for the SDP meeting?
No, I don't think so. I think all of that is secondary. That can wait.
Okay, good. Well, thanks again, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
all.
So
Just
this
to
is
say,
being recorded,
I
right?
the session, yes, I did. So we will look at it and then we will share with the panelists. And if you are happy with it, we will think about ways of sharing that. I personally learned loads from all of you. I am so happy, listening, getting exactly what I wanted to get personally. So I'm going to be really honest and selfish. It was really, really great to hear all of you with different views, and I've taken quite a few learnings for myself or for what we would like to do in BP as well. So I am really grateful to all of you, again, generously sharing with us in the way you've done it. Such an open sort of discussion, amazing. So the recording will be made available, and then we will check with you. If you're happy, then we can circulate it out a bit more. We might write a little bit of a conclusion in or some ideas. The chat is hot, really good. That chat is getting downloaded now, and I'm going to look at it and incorporate it as well. So we hope we can produce something that you can then use later. And thank you very much again, all of you, and the people organizing this. There were quite a few meetings where some of you were there. So Jack Gordon was there, Audrey Del Bosco was there, Ify was there, Mike was there, myself, Jean-Paul and Warwick. Quickly, all of us working together, getting the questions right and organizing all of this. And thank you very much to the team behind it as well. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.